Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hyperspace on Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris Blue Raven. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and a special thank you to webmaster and producer Keith Rowland. And my special guest this evening is Selena Fox. And it seems really quiet there, but I'm sure we're still connected. Okay, Selena Fox is a nature priestess, pagan rights activist, writer, psychotherapist, green cemetery director, and forest witch. Her writings on celebrating the seasons, ancestors, nature magic, and other topics have been widely published online and in print. She travels internationally presenting workshops and rituals, and also does teaching through her weekly internet radio show. Selena is founder of Circle Sanctuary, which has been serving pagans worldwide since 1974, and also is executive director of Pagan Spirit Gathering, a national global summer solstice festival. And her websites are www.selenafox.com and www.circlesanctuary.org. And please welcome Selena to the show this evening. And Selena, how are you?
Great. Wonderful to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you on tonight. So thank you for joining us. It's quite the honor. And you sound great. Yeah. So I'd like to talk to you about what you're up to these past few months. What projects are you working on currently?
I'm doing a variety of different events, both in person and online. I have been involved with our annual Pagan Spirit Gathering, as well as other festivals for celebrating the seasons. Our next one is the Green Spirit Festival, August 1st through 3rd. We have some of our events at Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve, which is near Barneveld, Wisconsin, and some events we hold in other places. So that keeps me busy. I also am continuing to do teaching online through Circle Craft Study, which is a weekly radio show in which I do workshops and sometimes rituals. So I'm starting a new series on green witchery to teach people about working with all sorts of different types of plants, herbs and trees and vines in sacred ways as part of spiritual practice. Oh. And another thing that I'm working on has to do with civil rights work to uphold equal rights for people who are practitioners of nature religions.
Excellent. That's fabulous. I'm so glad. I really appreciate what you're doing with the work that you're doing with pagan rights. I know that's it seems to me like things have gotten better along that path, but how are things lately?
There have been many successes over the years, so that's the good news. However, just because we have the Constitution and freedom of religion doesn't mean that it's being implemented in every place within the U.S. And certainly some of the pagan rights situations we've been providing some support for have been in other countries as well. But in the United States, that has had religious freedom as a foundational principle, you would think by now, after 238 years, we would finally have equality, liberty, and justice for all. However, we're continuing to do some corrective feedback to governments and other aspects of society to help remind people about those principles and to truly have that equality for pagans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I'm glad to hear that that's going in the right direction. It seems like it is, but yeah, I agree with you. There's a little glitchiness going on with paganism and the craft in general. But insofar as the green witchery goes, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that. I know you do have a show right after my show, so if you want to let people know real quick when they can hop over and actually listen to that later.
Yeah, well, green witchery is my term for working with plants as part of the craft and spiritual practice with contemporary and ancient-rooted or traditional witchcraft. And I will be starting a series tonight. I do a weekly audio workshop show called Circle Craft Study. The Circle Craft tradition is not only a contemporary tradition, but it incorporates some ancient pagan folkways as part of its mix. And every week it's from 8 to 9 p.m. Central on Pagans Tonight Radio Network.
Awesome.
And it's great to be able to be on this network and to celebrate the work that you and others are doing to explore the mysteries of life and the universe.
Absolutely. Well said. Not a doubt. And I'd like for you to cover just a little bit of the history of magic and the craft for our listeners, for those who are kind of a little bit green to insofar as what the craft really entails, because there's so much mainstream information that's based in so bogusness. It just doesn't even cover the truth in any form or design.
Well, so a good way to start is which witch is which. The word witch is a really loaded term for many people. And even with the word witch getting a wider range of symbols and imagery in pop culture, such as the Harry Potter books and movies, in which, the witch word is seen as someone who's connected with what some would call magic and the core principles of nature. That essentially there have been witches in different cultures and different places since ancient times. In contemporary times, there are people who are actively reclaiming the word witch to mean someone who understands nature ways as well as the powers of mind and combining them as part of spiritual practice. Most people who would call themselves witches today would also say that they are part of contemporary paganism. Pagan originally coming from the Latin pagani, meaning dweller in the country. And there have been people practicing nature religions rooted in old Europe and the Mediterranean for thousands of years, and now pretty much worldwide there are people who are embracing contemporary paganism and old and new forms of witchcraft. Witchcraft is about being in harmony with nature. It has nothing to do with evil, devil worship, or any of the other things that sometimes are put forth in an attempt to suppress it. Clearly, there were periods of time on the planet where anyone who was practicing a form of spirituality or philosophy that was different than the accepted forms of a country or place could be demonized and put to death for their practices. And that's where some of the negativity and misconceptions around the witch word started emerging. 1,600 years of bad PR. However, there are people working to re-educate and to reclaim the witch word as a term that is the equivalent of someone who practices some form of spiritual healing and spiritual medicine ways. Amongst Native American tribes, often a person with that knowledge of spiritual healing and plants would be known as a medicine person, a medicine man, a medicine woman. And clearly there are people who are rooted in traditions that extend back to ancient Europe and the Mediterranean that are choosing to use the witch word in a positive way for their practices.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm glad they're doing that. Be proud of that witch word. It's interesting, too. I've heard also that the warlock, which they used to call the oathbreaker, they're reclaiming that as well. Is that true?
That's a mix. I guess my answer to that is mixed. Mm-hmm. There are some people that are saying, let's use this term in a different way and are using that for themselves. But there are other people who really see that term as having too much of a complicated and negative history to be reclaimed. So there is not a consensus on whether to keep that word in the language or not, and when it comes to referencing, practicing some old ways and new forms. Clearly, if you look at some of the pop culture expressions, including Bewitched, the sitcom featuring a witch in the 1960s in America. The warlock word was used there in a more positive format, but other people refuse to reclaim it because it was used by some in a very negative sense, and some people kind of put it in the same category as a swastika. Swastika originally, and it's still used that way in some parts of India and Southwest Native American artwork as a sun symbol, but the Nazis, having used it in connection with genocide and really much horrific activity, there's some people who just say it's a lost cause. We're not going to try to reclaim that symbol.
Right. Well, it makes sense. It's what you do with what you have and the symbolism behind it. I mean, it's the intent behind it. Just like insofar as the craft itself goes, there's really no dark or light. It's really what you do with the energy. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think if you see the powers of mind, the powers of energy as more of a neutral force, a car, for example, you can drive a car responsibly and it can get you from one place to another, or one can use a car as a weapon. You get thrown in jail for that if you survive that. So it's really important to look at ethics, intention, character as one makes one's way into the complicated, ever-changing world of magic and enchantment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not everything is as it seems. So it's really important to develop one's skills intuitively, being able to tap into that inner knowing, as well as developing really good skills of critical thinking so that the intellect is also engaged in assessing a situation.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
It shouldn't be one or the other. It shouldn't be either you use your intellect or you use your intuition. A much better way is to have them both as part of your way of looking at situations, reflecting on situations, and making decisions.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that too. And insofar as some areas, there are some groups obviously that do some form of black magic. So when we're doing ritual, or when there is a ritual performed and it permeates through many different dimensions, would you say the more coarse and hostile the intent is, the less it expands into other dimensional spaces? Meaning that what they're putting out, because it's such low order or low vibration, it wouldn't have an effect?
It totally depends on how chaotic a practitioner is as to, or how focused a practitioner is as to what the results and the influences are.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, if one is seeking to develop one's own potentials individually, and if one's part of a group, it is important that one takes a look at ethics, balance, wisdom, service, and a variety of other characteristics in determining who you're going to align with and what your focus is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I see that the deeper parts of magic really are coming from a source within oneself that connects us with each other. Whatever you send out does get magnified and returns. Now, in some craft traditions, the concept is whatever you send out comes back threefold. And I certainly recognize that is an adage in a number of traditions. I've adapted it somewhat as I've talked about it with others, that whatever one sends out is magnified and returns, because it's been my experience that as a person becomes more advanced in their spiritual development and in their ability to focus spiritual intention, that the magnification can be much greater than 3 times. And for somebody who's just fooling around and really doesn't know what they're doing, it may have little effect whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you on that one for sure. So, insofar as the coven hive mind goes, would you say there's some kind of entanglement between the coveners on a karmic level, or I mean, obviously they do ritual together, but is there still an entanglement in their personal lives, everyday lives, because of the ritual work that's being done?
When one is part of a coven or other spiritual group that meets regularly and there are deep spiritual bonds, you're going to experience that in multiple dimensions of one's life. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's important before one starts practicing with a group to really get a sense of the group and their values and ethics and if they're compatible with your own. Mm-hmm. One of the positive things about being part of an ongoing group is that when one is in need, others may pick up on it even before you attempt to communicate by phone or text or message. There's an awareness of it, and one is able to receive some spiritual support without even asking for it.
Mm-hmm. I agree on that one too. And I'd like for you to cover a little bit about the Circle Sanctuary. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, Circle Sanctuary is the name of the center that I helped birth about 40 years ago. Nice. It began at Samhain in 1974. We began as an organization to help bring together people of many different paths of the craft and paganism for mutual support and to work together for a better world. We ended up eventually getting a place for our headquarters. So in 1983, we moved to a 200-acre piece of land called Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve, which is near Barneveld, Wisconsin, in the southwest part of the upper Midwest of the USA. And over the years, we have continued to grow and develop. We do a number of different services for free for those who are in the craft and related forms of paganism, not only in the United States, but around the world. We publish a quarterly magazine. We put on a variety of different events, as mentioned before. We have healing services that we do, and actually have a Facebook group called the Circle Healing Circle, where people can post their healing request. We operate the Nature Preserve, that is our headquarters, that also has ceremonial sites on it. And we do pagan religious freedom work, and we do some specialty chaplaincy work for pagans serving in the U.S. military, for pagans on college campuses, pagans that are in hospitals and hospices, in prisons, and some other situations. We have people that are providing some support in those areas. And we have quite a bit of information about paganism and about the craft, not only available through our quarterly magazine, Circle Magazine, but up on the web. So at www.circlesanctuary.org, you can get more information as well as get some of the resources that we have available.
That's wonderful. Oh, I'm so appreciative of what you're doing here on this planet. I really want to thank you for that. That's wonderful work you're doing. And your group, so thank you. And gosh, yeah, it sounds lovely out there.
Well, one of the things that we had been doing since 1995 at Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve is Circle Cemetery. And as far as I know, we are the first national pagan cemetery established. And we have not only an option to have cremains scattered and interred there, but we also are now doing full body burials in a green way. So we're one of the first green or conservation cemeteries in the U.S. A green cemetery is a cemetery dedicated to preserving green space and which does not have any burial of bodies unless they're unembalmed. So we're one of the ones that have been working with the green burial movement, and we are a national pagan cemetery, and we have pagans who have lived in different parts of the U.S. whose remains are now up at our cemetery. We have a ridge top where that's the oldest part of the cemetery, where we have a number of our grave sites, and several years ago we opened up the burying ground portion after we expanded the cemetery and went through some additional governmental registration work. And we've been not only doing natural burial education as well as the practices right at Circle Cemetery, but we've been encouraging other people to consider greener alternatives for greening the end of life.
I think that's wonderful. I love it. Yeah, and you also include animals in that, right?
That's right. We have several areas where we have companion creatures, their bodies laid to rest or their cremains. And we've been doing that pretty much since we began our cemetery back in 95.
That's wonderful. Yeah, what a great place. I'll have to look that up when I transfer out.
Well, when we do our magazine, we have what we call community passages. And one of the things that gets remarked upon from time to time is the fact that when we list obituaries, we not only have a section for humans who have crossed over that had a connection with our center and or with paganism as a whole, but we also have obituaries for loved ones that are dogs and cats and other companion creatures, people that seek to remember their loved ones of the creature form in that way.
That's wonderful. That's just fabulous. Yeah, I wish more people would do that. And I guess, did you say you're the only area that does this throughout the United States?
Well, we're one of the first green cemeteries. There's about 36 green cemeteries now in the USA. There are hundreds of them in Europe and some other parts of the world. And actually, having a cemetery where unembalmed bodies are laid to rest is a really old practice. That's an ancient pagan burial practice. But what makes a green cemetery different is that you take this ancient burial practice, unembalmed bodies, letting the bodies in a container such as a pine box or wicker basket return to the earth. And you're combining this ancient burial practice with the contemporary practice of preserving green space.
Exactly. Yeah, wish everybody would do that. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, too, the embalming gel they use, it turns the body into like some form of a gel. I believe it's quite toxic, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah, this is what's really ironic in a lot of ways is that first of all, embalming in the United States as a common practice really got its start in the Civil War. It's not that old of a practice, but it's become very widespread, and part of how it got established was the massive kill-off of the Civil War. People wanted the loved ones' bodies returned, and so embalming started to be the way to make that happen. Now many people think that you have to get your body embalmed after you die if you don't do the cremation option, and that's simply not true. It depends on the cemetery. Depends on a variety of factors. And increasingly, the greener alternatives are becoming more known and more chosen. When you think about people who spend their whole lives eating healthy, avoiding pesticides in their foods, trying to be in an area with clean air and clean water, does it really make sense that toxic chemicals are put into their bodies after they've died?
Exactly.
Yeah, it doesn't. It basically, besides the toxicity of embalming, you also have the use of resources. Most caskets, well, depending on where you are in the U.S., but most parts of the U.S., they're going with metal caskets that really are made to last, not to break down, and liners in the grave of cement or fiberglass made not to break down. So the important thing about green burial is that it's something that would be good to consider. It not only is more economical, but it's a way of more sustainable way for humans dealing with end of life on the planet.
Exactly. I so agree. And you also work with the people who are transferring out or are close to the transfer one-on-one, or no?
Oh, in terms of the transported bodies and things?
Well, in terms of them being, say they only have a few days left and they're transferring out, so do you do some kind of...
so the crossing over, the end of
Right.
life. Yes,
Yeah.
I've done quite a bit of work, and we have several people in our community that are death midwives that help with that process, and I do think being able to help the dying have a beautiful death, to be surrounded by love and support, to be able to transition in peaceful, beautiful ways. I mean, what a gift that is. And so one of the wonderful things about people really looking at greening the end of life, it's not only looking at how to take the bodily remains and let them go back to the earth in responsible and low carbon footprint ways, but as people are ending their life, to really provide means for the beauty of that transition to be present, and for people to have choice.
Right. That's very important. And also, not to change the subject here, but do you also instruct children in the path or on the path of mysticism or the craft?
Yes, we have a variety of youth programs at our various events. Our largest event, Pagan Spirit Gathering, has so many children coming with their parents to take part in this week-long celebration of summer solstice, that in addition to having a center for the real young children, we have a tween center and a teen center for older youth. And as part of our programming, we have activities for these various age groupings.
Wonderful. That's great.
In fact, just this year, some young people who are now young adults were hand fasted. I did their hand fasting at Pagan Spirit Gathering, and they literally grew up in the Pagan Spirit Gathering community. They were there every year for a period of number of years, and it was just really wonderful to be able to celebrate and facilitate their pagan marriage.
That's great. Yeah. Oh, I love hearing that. That's just wonderful. And what lineage of the craft are you affiliated with? I know, if I'm not mistaken, you're connected to the Masons too, right?
Right, yeah. My family, there have been multiple generations Masons, and had I been male in this life, I most likely would be a Mason as well. However, there are some branches of Masonic traditions, co-Masons, rooted in France, where men and women both are part of lodges. But the lodges that my family have been connected with have been Scottish Rite Masonry, and at the present time, there's Eastern Star for the women and Masons for the men. My own background in the craft really has several aspects to it. some people would say I would best fit in a category called hedge witch, very much working with folk magic practices. I started a form of the craft called circle craft a number of years ago. Back in the 70s, I call it circle Wicca, and then in the 80s, I called it Wiccan shamanism, and shamanic Wiccan spirituality. Increasing numbers of people, though, were blending shamanism with Wiccan practice. So more recently, I've, renamed it again and called it circle craft to help distinguish it from the many, many varieties there now are, people that have shamanistic dimensions of the craft that they practice. And so what circle craft is, it blends together some old traditional ways as well as contemporary pagan folk ways and transpersonal and humanistic psychology.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. And who actually taught you the craft, or were you a solitaire for a while, or?
I did my own practice for many years. My 1971, I met a practitioner of family craft. Some people might call it hereditary craft or hedge witchery craft. And she had been taught by her grandmother, and it was rooted in Prussia, a place then known as Prussia, and came over to the United States with those practices. And I happened to meet her while working on an archaeological dig in Tidewater, Virginia. We were learning about colonial life by going through debris in a colonial tavern dump site.
Wow.
Yeah. And I met her in the lab, and we realized that our forms of spirituality and practice were really similar. So she invited me to take part in ceremonies she was doing. It was much more informal. There wasn't like a book with lots of, laid out rituals and things. It was basically folk magic practices connected with honoring the moon as a goddess.
Oh,
and so I was I practiced that form of craft for a number of years. And then later in my journey, I encountered some other practitioners of other forms of the craft. So circle craft, which I helped birth, while certainly I've been one of the prime movers, I have not been the only influence on it. It is a synthesis of a number of old survivals as well as revivals and contemporary crafted forms of spiritual practice. So we do not claim to be, 2,000-year-old tradition or anything like that. However, some of the influences that have been part of circle craft at its foundation are from old Scotland. They're from the Baltic, and they're from Prussia.
Cool. Wow. Take the best from all those worlds, right?
Yeah, the Baltic came in the very first coven that Circle Sanctuary had, which was before Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve came to be. We had a rented farmhouse near Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and we had a very small group that met regularly. And one of the people in the group was from Latvia. And he had been displaced by World War II. He had come to America and had been in America for decades before he encountered anyone whose spiritual practices at all resembled his own. When he grew up in the first part of the 20th century, people were celebrating summer solstice in old pagan ways. It had a Christian veneer, being called St. John's Night and St. John's Day, but it was a summer solstice celebration. People processed with living flame in the form of torches and candle lanterns. They kindled a huge bonfire and kept it burning for multiple days. we have kept alive that ancient Baltic pagan practice as part of our pagan spirit gathering community. Every year we start off our celebration with our opening ritual, and it includes processing around the village that we have creatively made together for the week with candlelight, and we kindle a big fire and we keep it burning for the entire celebration.
Oh, how wonderful. That sounds great.
I think it's important to keep alive old pagan folkways, but also important to have practices be relevant for the here and now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. Very much so. And did you actually go through initiations now, or was it just something else different?
I've gone through several initiations in different systems, and there was a form of craft called the Druidic craft of the wise, and it came out of the Ozarks. And early on in my priestess life, I had already been practicing as a priestess with a group, but we ended up helping a subgroup of the Druidic craft of the wise, and as Thanksgiving for us helping that group, we were offered initiation into that system. Nice. And accepted. So that's how I became a priestess in the Druidic craft of the wise. And I've actually had initiations in several spiritual traditions, including a yogic one. Early on in my craft studies, in addition to studying Wicca and pantheism and classical paganism, I also studied some other spiritual traditions, including a yogic one.
Nice.
So, and I see that initiation into a tradition really helps attune one to the wisdom of those traditions. I have been upfront with the systems in which I've received initiation that I clearly, from the very beginning, have been blazing my own path, and the initiators have been totally fine with that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the best way to go. And what is your impression of the night? Was it Gerald Gardner and the Wicca coming from England?
I've had quite a bit of contact with people who are Gardnerian, and both in this country as well as in other places, the UK and Canada, Australia. And while the Gardnerian path is not the path of the craft that I practice, I do celebrate the many contributions that path has made to contemporary paganism, and many people are incorporating symbol systems, the Wheel of the Year, and other aspects of Gardnerian craft, or that at least were popularized by Gardnerian craft without necessarily even knowing those roots. There was a documentary on Gerald Gardner that came out fairly recently and was shown on nationwide television in the UK. And one of the interesting things about taking a look at that documentary was just seeing the diversity that has emerged from the Gardnerian path, as well as really learning about some of the influences on Gardner himself. And I'm not just mentioning that particular film because there's a very short clip of me and a woman named Roberta Stewart towards the end of the movie. And when talking about pagan rites, we had done some work with getting the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to put the pinnacle, the five-pointed star in the circle, on the list of the emblems of belief that can be included on the grave markers that the VA issues for deceased veterans. So I'm not just mentioning the movie because there is a bit of that pagan rites bit that we were in at the end. I do think it is a good idea to really document different influences and teachers and trends that have been part of contemporary paganism.
Exactly.
And I think it did a very good job of pulling together some of that history.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw that actually. Yeah, for sure. And it seems like, well, nowadays, of course, the Pentacle is respected with the military. But when did that change? What year was that?
2007.
Wow.
It was a 10-year battle. And although Wiccans and other pagans had been able to have Wicca and Druid and pagan on their dog tags in various parts of the military, for a number of years, when it came to the VA and issuing markers with a pagan symbol, it took 10 years and the cooperation of a lot of people to make that happen.
Thank goodness. I think it would have happened sooner, but I applaud you for your efforts in making that happen. I know you were a big influence in that, so thank you.
Yeah, there were so many different people that converged their efforts. Americans United for Separation of Church and State was the organization that represented Circle Sanctuary, and some of our members in the lawsuit against the VA that finally got settled and got the symbol on the list. But the ACLU was involved. There were numerous other pagan groups. There were people who were not pagan at all that just joined in this effort to have equal rights because they recognized we really need to have equality, liberty, and justice for all. And I'm really hoping as we move in to the future that increasingly we will have more opportunities to have that equality without having to fight for it.
Mm-hmm. I so agree. What do you see down the road for us here in the U.S.?
Well, I am hoping within the next 10 years somebody can run for a high office in our land as a pagan, as a witch, as a Wiccan, without that being considered a political liability.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Wouldn't that be great?
There are people who have held public office, mayors of some small towns, some people on city councils. Usually they are not talking about their spiritual affiliation because they're not out to convert anybody or whatever. And some people do like to pull up any bit of controversy around alternative spirituality and use it as a weapon in political campaigns. So I'm hoping that there'll be enough understanding and it will be so widespread that people can be open about their involvement in the craft and paganism, and it's not considered any big deal.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah, full speed ahead on that one. Wow, you'd be a good candidate for something like that.
Well, I've done some work with local government in land use planning, and they were fully aware what my spirituality was, but what they were more interested in was the fact that I've been doing environmental work for many years, and they thought it was important to have somebody with a strong environmental background to be part of the process of land use planning with cultural and natural resources. So that's how I got to head up the committee that took a look at those issues and put together suggestions that eventually became part of our land use planning.
Wow, that's awesome. You've done some important work here on this world. You really have. I've followed a lot of your information. And you know, I've heard about the Masons, and I obviously have also a connection to the Masons on my mother's side, the Scottish Rite Masons. What about the pentagram, or the pentacle rather, and in their ceremonies? Obviously, they use that as well. Don't you think that the craft itself is a parallel to the Masonic ritual?
There are so many parallels. There are so many aspects of Scottish Rite Masonry that you will find within many craft traditions, and certainly the pinnacle is one of them. The use of that five-pointed star in a circle, ancient symbol. We know it goes back at least 2,000 years. There's some artifacts rooted in ancient pagan Greece in which the pinnacle was used. And the idea of illumination, of freedom, the idea of separation of church and state, hardwired into the United States, and part of how that came to be is that a number of the founders were Masons, and a number of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons, and those who signed on to the U.S. Constitution and its Bill of Rights also had, not all, but some were Masons. And America owes quite a lot to those who were part of Scottish Rite Masonry. And America also owes a lot to the classical traditions that are basically Greek and Roman pagan ways of being. You know, democracy is said to have started in pagan Greece. Mm-hmm. And systems for having rule of law and houses of government have their roots in old Rome. And I do think it's important for those in the U.S. to broaden their understanding of America and its diversity, mm-hmm. and to recognize that there are ancient traditions that are alive and well in America, and America is a diverse country, not just a so-called Christian nation, that from its very earliest days there were people with a wide range of beliefs that helped give birth to our nation.
Mm-hmm. I so agree with you. Yeah, a lot of mysticism involved in all that, and it's interesting because a lot of people have superstition towards the Masons, and everybody gets weirded out about ceremony. But I think if they had just researched it a little more and actually participated, they probably all those fears would just drop away.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just interesting, but I think that a lot of that's been propaganda. So, but it has changed quite a bit. But you come from an old family now, right? Aren't you Scottish too?
Yes, I'm actually an American blend. I have quite a bit of Scottish ancestral heritage. I'm part Native American Cherokee. I've got English and Irish and French and Swedish and German and a whole host of other influences. On my father's side, that's one of my Scottish lines, and on my father's mother's side, there are also some really old Scottish lines there. And I've been to Scotland a couple times and hope to be able to go back. And certainly I honor all the strands of ethnic and national heritage that are part of my mix. But there are certain strands that I have really strong affinity to, and the Scottish roots are among the ones I have the strongest resonance with.
Mm-hmm. Likewise, yeah, definitely. I have some Scottish roots too. We're probably related somewhere down there. It's interesting. What about the, why do you think that the women are actually separated from the males in the Masonic lodges?
I think in 1717, when the lodges, as they are said to be now, were birthed, there was quite a bit of separation of between women and men in public life and in private life. And while some say that the Scottish Rite Masonry actually goes back into ancient times and look at the medieval stonemasons guilds and before, when we're looking at 18th century, and there are a variety of different social clubs, and they were by gender. And even looking at how some of the great houses of the aristocracy were designed and created and used not only in the UK but in America, as it was still in its colonial phase at that time. Women had certain traditions and places to be. Men had certain traditions and places to be. So I think part of that came from the fact of that separation back then. But I'm truly hoping in my lifetime that I will see a integration of Scottish Rite Masonry and having men and women both have the options. Is that going to happen or not? I've talked to some people about that in recent years. There doesn't seem to be a big push for that right now, but maybe within the next 100 years,
Wow.
it might come to be. There are some good things that can happen by having humans in particular groupings. But as a second wave feminist that's continuing to be out working for a world where women truly have equality in every aspect of society, it truly is my hope that that aspect of Scottish Rite Masonry does become open to women and men.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That would be really nice to see that. Yeah, well, just like with the god and the goddess and in ritual and circle, there's the high priest and priestess, and they're equals. So, yep.
Yeah, I do think that increasingly, as men and women experience a wider range of ways of being in society, it will make it easier for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And is there
when I grew up, there was so much separation. In fact, part of going into graduate school, there were some schools just not open to me.
Wow.
Because I was female.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I was one of the first women to break the gender barrier at Rutgers University in 1971.
Wow.
It was an all-male institution. At that time, there was Douglas College, an all-women's college that was associated with Rutgers. But when I went to graduate school, I was one of the first women to bring gender equality at Rutgers as an institution.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well,
and breaking into the field of industrial photography a few years later, very much a male domain. Mm-hmm. So I was one of the few women corporate photographers in the 1970s in Madison, Wisconsin. And that was its own adventure. Mm-hmm. So it seems like part of this life has been being part of bringing about more equality to the world, and it's my hope that the work that not only that I've done, but thousands and thousands of other people have done will continue to bloom and move us ahead. But unfortunately, there are some reactionary forces that seem attached to having women be second-class citizens, and government trying to tell women what they can and cannot have regarding birth control is something that I see is very problematic.
I agree. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're going to move that out of the way.
Yeah, and I do think part of, getting back to the craft, part of the craft itself is a place where women and men both can be leaders, that can be equals within a circle, And I do think part of the reason the craft and other forms of contemporary paganism have grown so extensively in the U.S. and other parts of the world is because people want to be in a form of religion and spiritual practice where there is that equality.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And it almost seems to me, I mean, like a no-brainer that it's equal. You know, when you think of the soul as an androgynous, energetic form, I mean, it's the suit is the suit, whether it's male or female, in my opinion. So to me, that's the way I perceive it anyway. So I never understood how people could discriminate against the male and the female.
Yeah, well, I've had some close encounters of the bigoted kind as I've gone through this incarnation, and I have, when I've encountered anti-woman prejudice, I have endeavored to learn from it, work to get it corrected, and to have it be a story to share, to help bring about an awareness and a motivation to have a world with more equality. When I was in undergraduate school, women had a rule book we had to memorize and could not go walking in the woods without signed parent permission. Had to be in our dorms by 11 o'clock at night on a weeknight, and all sorts of other kinds of things. Men on campus, no rules. So I was radicalized in a way. The fact that women, there were only 25% of the campus were women, and you had to have a much higher grade point average to get into the campus. That was hard enough, but here we women who, as a whole, as a group, had higher grade point average than the men on campus, were treated like we were little babies. And that did not sit well with me. The only time in this life that I've ever led and been part of a massive book burning was in organizing the burning of the women's rule book on the college campus. And most of the people that showed up were men. They were all in favor of women having more freedom, but most of the women were just not equipped to do that kind of challenging. And I'm happy to say by the time I graduated that the rules had changed and gotten more equalized.
Nice.
But yeah, there's battles that I've been part of regarding birth control, reproductive choice, that I'm seeing having to be fought again 50 years later.
Right. Yeah, it almost seems like we're going backwards sometimes when I view the world, and especially here in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think part of what has to happen is that people need to not only get out and vote, but be informed voters.
Exactly.
Not only what candidates are supposedly in favor of, but who's funding them and what is the agenda of the people funding them.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, we have another one coming up, 2016?
There's elections later this year, and yes, there will be another presidential election coming up, and I do hope that people will pay attention to equality issues as well as environmental issues.
Exactly, because we have an awful lot of fracking going on right now, which I don't support.
It is one of the worst things that is being visited on this planet. Oklahoma has had so much fracking going on that it literally appears to be linked to the increase in the earthquakes there.
Yep.
In Wisconsin, it's sand fracking. It's harvesting the sand that's part of what's being used in the fracking process. And there are ad campaigns going out claiming that fracking is the new clean green energy. It is not. Poisons are being put in the earth. The earth is being fractured. And while natural gas, many people say, is better than the coal, there are plenty of other sources of energy that can be developed, including solar and wind and geothermal, that really we would do well to invest in as a society.
I agree also. And I'm sure that the fracking does some kind of damage to ley lines energetically.
I haven't seen anything specifically written about that, but it stands to reason when you are putting piping down into the earth and, you're basically changing the environment at a very deep level, that clearly is compromising the environment within the earth.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. Well, we're going to head for a break real quick. Everybody stay tuned. Dark Matter Radio Network. My special guest, Selena Fox. Welcome back, everybody, to Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris Blue-Ribbon, and I'm here with my very special guest, Selena Fox. And Selena, are you with me?
Yes.
Yay. It's wonderful listening to what you have to say tonight. I really appreciate you being here. Once again, I'd like to inform everybody insofar as where they can get a hold of you and your website and all that good stuff.
Yes, you can connect with me through Circle Sanctuary on the web. It's www.circlesanctuary.org. If you want to reach us by phone, it's 608-924-2216. By email, circle@circlesanctuary.org. And you'll also find us on Facebook for the Circle Sanctuary community. And you can connect with me on Facebook at Selena Fox Updates. In addition, I'm on Twitter. Selena_Fox is a way to connect with me there. And I have a website, www.selenafox.com. So we have multiple ways of being in touch.
Excellent. Thank you. That's wonderful. So where do you think the largest Wiccan community lies in the U.S.?
That's a good question, because there are many different groupings of people, and some of the people, such as the Bay Area in California, there's thousands of people there, but all of them may not use the Wiccan word for themselves. They may be having some similar practices. There's certainly very large communities along the big urban areas within our country. But increasingly, there are groups and communities that are in small town and rural areas as well. Not everybody has chosen to put themselves out to connect with others through social media. So some people are pretty much keeping to themselves and maybe will show up at an event, a multi-traditional event, from time to time. Pagan Pride Days happen every year in a whole variety of different communities. They're part of the Pagan Pride Project, and that would be a real good indicator of the diversity of paganism and craft in various areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And I think also looking at where national and regional festivals are held. Pagan Spirit Gathering we began 34 years ago, So we're one of the oldest ones. We had people coming from all around the nation and from a whole host of different craft and other pagan traditions. And it's one type of cross-section of American pagan diversity. And we have people from other countries that have been part of our community over the years as well. There are some communities that have their own kinds of regional festivals, and that can be just a great way for people to connect with each other. It's a way of converging the diversity, but celebrating it rather than trying to homogenize everyone.
Exactly. I know we have the Grand Coven here that we have every year. I'm sure you have something similar where you are, right?
I think Pagan Spirit Gathering serves that function for some people, but not all people that come to Pagan Spirit Gathering are Wiccan. So in that way, it's different. There's certainly a number of traditions have their own particular gatherings, and that's exciting as well. I was in Colorado in May.
Whoa, where'd you go? Are you there? Hang on, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, I don't know what happened. All of a sudden you were there and then you disappeared. Poof.
Oh, okay. Well, the wonders of technology. But yes, there are lots of different events that are happening around the country, and I'm excited about that.
Well, excellent. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there, but you just kind of got dropped. So, anyways,
yeah, when I'm in Silicon Valley area every year in February, there's something called PantheaCon, and it's like 3,000 to 4,000 people show up there for this wonderful gathering. And that's more of an indoor hotel conference form. There's something in St. Louis, Missouri called the Pagan Picnic, and several thousand people show up for that event. It's exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I love the events when you get to connect with other like minds, for sure. And so far as Wicca itself goes, now, why do you think it was so important for Wicca to become recognized as a religion? Obviously, prior to Wicca, there were traditional craft practices. So what what is the difference between Wicca and the craft in general, and why do you think it was so important for it to become a religion?
Well, there's many people using the Wicca word in different ways. So I'll begin with that. When I went traveling and speaking in Europe for the first time about 20-some years ago, I discovered that in the UK at that time, Wicca was more narrowly defined as people who were Gardnerian or part of British traditional craft. In America, the Wicca word has a wider range of using that word to define their practices. And I think that part of what's happened as we have become global as a people, that it's been necessary in different areas to use different terminology and ways of being in order to survive and to thrive. So certainly in the U.S., the Wiccan word was used probably more than pagan in the early days in order to and used in a religious sense in order to uphold the rights to be able to practice our ways. The first time that the craft as Wicca came under attack on national scale was in 1985, when a U.S. senator from North Carolina succeeded in getting an amendment to a postal appropriations bill passed through the whole U.S. Senate that would have defined the Wiccan religion as second class as devil worshiping, evil, and we would have lost our rights. And that was the first time that people from so many different branches of the craft, whether they called themselves Wiccan or not, because there were some parts of the craft where Wicca is not used, witchcraft is used, witch and witchcraft is used instead of Wicca. So kind of across the board, lots of people joined together to express their concern on Capitol Hill about this unconstitutional piece of legislation that was in danger of becoming law, because the postal appropriations bill had to be passed because that's what funded our post office, and this was in the days before email and social media were widespread. So I really think in the United States, part of the Wicca equals religion piece really came out of necessity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the craft was under attack, and I was part of the efforts to get rid of this Amendment 705 to the Postal Appropriations Bill. It went to a joint conference committee, and people would contact their senator and Congress people who are on that committee, and basically there was such an uproar made that all of a sudden Capitol Hill became aware that there were Wiccans, there were witches, and there were pagans for the first time in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And because so many people took action, and there was such a round of protest about this, that it really started raising awareness of nature religion in America, and the people that were originally behind the bill amendment got wind of this protest, and then they jumped into the fray to try to encourage people to keep the amendment. And then it became such a hot political potato that the committee decided to drop the amendment, not because it was unconstitutional, but because it was not appropriate to the legislation to which it was attached. So there was a convenient excuse used to do that, but unfortunately it resulted in a victory for the craft and paganism.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think after fighting that national battle in 1985 that we wouldn't have to do another national battle.
Right.
But in 1999, we had another opportunity to communicate with people up on Capitol Hill. And that's when Bob Barr, who was a U.S. congressman from Georgia, attempted to get legislation passed, not once but twice, that would make it illegal for Wiccans in the U.S. military to be able to practice their religion at U.S. military installations.
Mm.
So there was a whole battle around that, and fortunately the Department of Defense stood strong and basically said that, it is not constitutional for the government to pick and choose what religions to accommodate.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a huge fuss surrounding that. And one of the casualties, unfortunately, of Bob Barr and his anti-witch crusade is that Circle Sanctuary, we were in the process of having the first U.S. military chaplain who was Wiccan go through the hoops, and we had made it through one level, and then all of this blew up, and then it was years before we were able to proceed. But by that point, while we finally got our application cleared, by that time the administration had changed and it was hostile.
Wow.
to witches, Wiccans, and pagans, and we were not able to be successful yet in that quest. And so rules got changed, and we're in the process of doing some additional education of people who are interested in being a U.S. military chaplain, but we pretty much had to start all over again. So we've been working on that quest for nearly 20 years.
Wow. It's amazing. You think about
Well,
this.
and why we know there was a problem with that is not only because our application, Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, that it finally made it to his desk, refused to sign our Department of Defense Ecclesiastical Endorsing Organization Status application, which meant that our candidate could not be placed because he didn't turn us down, but he wouldn't sign. He kept us in bureaucratic limbo.
Mm-hmm.
And it was essentially that same tactic that was used to keep the Pentacle from being added to the list of the emblems of belief that could be issued by the VA for nearly 10 years.
Jeez.
They didn't turn it down, but they wouldn't accept it. And meanwhile, they were accepting applications for other religious emblems, and they were being added to the list.
Mm-hmm.
So 10-year battle to finally get that thing switched out. So there have been some major national battles for pagan rights. And to go back to your question, in each of those three cases, Wicca has been front and center. And the way to make sure that we would get our equal rights is to claim the church word and to claim the religion word.
Mm-hmm. That's unfortunate you had to do it.
Yeah, some covens just are not going to claim that church word. But Circle Sanctuary is established as a church, as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we're going to be celebrating 40 years this Samhain and been around for a long time. And because we've been around for a long time and we had been providing all these various services as religions of other types have been doing and other organizations, we had enough of that track record that it really made it easier for us to be able to stand up for pagan rights because we went the institutional route.
Right, yeah.
Not the route for all Wiccans and all witches and all pagans, but clearly that's a pathway that we ended up taking. And while that has certainly been a difficult road, I am thankful that we took that path and that we've gotten the support of so many people each time that we fight one of these battles.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it seems to me like they try to dovetail the Satanism with the Wicca for some reason, because every time I turn around, there's some kind of an article about this and that. And obviously, there's no connection, except for the symbols. What is your impression?
Well, what often gets missed when you get into mass media and talking about Satanism is that the pentacle gets used and turned upside down. The Christian cross gets used and turned upside down. Mm-hmm. The Christian cross isn't considered a so-called satanic symbol, even though some forms of Satanism use it. But the pentacle, which is used by witches and Wiccans and other pagans of many paths, has not been so fortunate in that regard of clarifying it. So part of the reason it took so long to get the symbol on the list, there was a lot of misunderstanding about what that symbol was.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think there still is with a lot of other people as well. And of course, I guess once again, it's just about doing the research and understanding what they're dealing with to some degree.
Well, when you think about it, we have 50 five-pointed stars in the American flag. Mm-hmm. If you go to historic monuments in Washington, D.C. and other parts of the country, you're going to see five-pointed stars in the art, the civic art. Sometimes they're encircled, sometimes they aren't. So essentially, 5-pointed stars are used by many people and many cultures through the ages, and I'm glad that we finally did get the pinnacle added to the list. In the time since the victory was won in 2007, there have been more than 100 different pinnacle markers issued and put to mark graves in private and public cemeteries.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
We have 9 of them at Circle Cemetery.
Nice.
In the area called Veterans Ridge. And while I'm certainly sad that those 9 veterans are no longer with us, I am glad that finally the option to have the symbol on a marker to mark a grave of a deceased veteran is an option.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's just like they assume, a lot of people assume the word demon is evil when correct me if I'm wrong, but its representation is a neutral spirit. And of course, I think the church converted it into something that was actually more demonic, or what they call evil, their version.
Yeah, that word has gone through some evolution, and I do think that in common usage now, it's generally not considered a very positive force.
Right.
So you have to be really aware of sources and material and choose words carefully.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Then it gets kind of muddied along the decades and, of course, centuries too. But yeah, it's quite interesting to watch it all kind of morph before our eyes. So, with that being said, what is your impression of curses, and do you think that people are capable of directing a curse at others, even on a hereditary level?
I think people direct their anger in a variety of ways at each other, whether they are involved in magical practice or not. So it's part of, I guess, the state of being human that we have a range of emotions. Certainly, I'm hoping that as more people become more self-aware, as well as connected with some form of spiritual system that really helps bring about healthier ways of being, not only for the individuals practicing a spiritual system, but for humans as a whole, as well as the circle of life as a whole. It is my hope that we will find nonviolent ways of processing anger. Mm-hmm. When somebody gets really angry, hurtful, hateful towards someone, one doesn't really have to do any kind of spell per se. There's an energy that goes out from that. Mm-hmm. And therefore, as we grow and develop as human beings, I think we have to pay attention to how words can hurt, projection of our emotions can hurt, and make some good choices about when we are angry to find ways of channeling that intensity to bring about something that's positive for the greater good. Mm-hmm. So clearly I was upset that it was taking years to get the pinnacle approved as a symbol. Mm-hmm. And clearly during all of that time, there were people expressing their upsetment as part of exercising their freedom of speech. That's all well and good. But what led to success was finding a way of directing that anger and that upsetment into channels to accomplish the goal.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
I think when people who have developed their powers of mind as they continue their life journey, they have to be particularly careful of how they interface with others.
Mm-hmm.
Because one's emotional and spiritual force can have a power, can have a sting to it. And I think it's really important with the developing of greater powers and intensity. I think one has to be aware, take responsibility for one's actions and the consequences of one's actions, and really find ways to do problem solving that are more evolved and more effective than being nasty.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yep, direct that energy in the right area for sure. And in a world
We're
of
all connected. Whatever we send out does come back, and it's usually magnified.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And of course, in a world of technology, do you think the spirit and aura is getting a bit distorted due to the perhaps dirty electricity being broadcast through various computer technologies and iPhones and all that?
I think it is changing how humans process information and relate to each other. Mm-hmm. There are some really positive things that have come from that with this interconnectivity, but increasingly, as humans spend more time with their devices and less time face-to-face, some things are getting missed, I think. Mm-hmm. I really hope that we can use the technology as tools to help us connect and as supplements to us being authentic, compassionate, supportive of each other,
mm-hmm. Exactly.
rather than having them isolate us. Mm. The bullying that's been happening online, not only amongst young people, but people of all ages. Some people will say stuff in a post to a social media site anonymously or using some name that's not their own, where they would most likely not do that face-to-face. Mm-hmm. So one of the downsides of electronic media and social media is the fact that there can be a depersonalization and a compartmentalization in terms of how we live our lives, which is why I think regardless if one is a city dweller in the suburbs or a rural area, one really should fast from electronic devices, to have several hours a day, if possible, where one lets go of that way of being in the world and gets out and in a natural environment, smells the beautiful plants around the environment, take in the beauty of the site, and to really have some unwired time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I agree. It's very well said indeed. And of course, a lot of people don't do that. But yeah, you have to have a balance.
Well, balance is really important. And certainly in ancient Greece, in some of the temples, there were certain mottos put forth. And one of those mottos, all things in moderation. And I do think it's really important for us to have a good balance in our lives with face-to-face connectivity with other humans and the larger circle of nature of which we're part, mm-hmm. but also some opportunities to explore and connect. And, the internet can help us do that. We can learn, we can check facts, we can look into the background when we hear of a particular situation. We can check multiple sites, multiple sources. It's how we choose to use the technology. It should be a tool that we use to improve our lives and the world around us, mm-hmm. rather than something that enslaves us.
I agree. Totally. Yep. Use with wisdom. And so far as the rituals go, obviously we work around the cycles of the moon. I was wondering if you could elaborate a
Yeah,
little bit on this because a lot of people get they don't understand what that entails. So you want to give us a rundown?
yeah, certainly. I in the circlecraft tradition, which I mentioned earlier, there are three nature cycles that we attune to. They're the life cycles: birth, growth, hand fastings, marriage, coming of age into seniorhood, old age, death. Okay, you've got the whole cycle of life, growth, death, rebirth. There is the cycles of the sun and seasons, celebrating the beginnings and midpoints of each of the four seasons. And then there's the lunar cycles. And with the lunar cycle, certainly the full moon is obvious when the skies are clear and you're out on a night sky, you can see that full moon. And for some people, their focus of their practice is around full moon times. But I think it's also important to celebrate all of the cycles of the moon, to celebrate the new moon, when the moon and the sun are conjoined in the sky, so you don't actually see the moon in the sky at new moon, the waxing moon, or some people call the half moon or even the quarter moon, and the waning moon. So for full moon, at Circle Sanctuary, we have an open full moon circle each month. And during our full moon circle, we will, with weather conditions permitting, we'll go outside and celebrate the rising of the moon, see the beauty of the moon, and this is throughout the whole year. So we're out there in the winter and we're out there in the summer. Nice. When it's available. And for us, the new moon is a time of transformations. The full moon is a time of visioning and manifestation. The waxing moon is a time of drawing what is needed to a situation, to ourselves, to our loved ones. The waning moon, a time of releasing, letting go. So all four phases of the moon are honored and celebrated. And I think one of the great things about celebrating the moon is, beside it being a really ancient practice, it's just really a wonderful experience to be under a full moon in particular, to have that quality of light be present in a natural place, or if one's in a more urban or suburban area, to be able to look at that and express the joy of seeing that within one's environment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, it's so beautiful and so empowering. Absolutely. And do you draw down the god and the goddess energy in ceremony?
Yes, there are different traditions about drawing down the moon. Mm-hmm. And this is different than some Wiccan traditions where the goddess is drawn down into the priestess by the priest, and the priestess draws the god down into the priest. Within Circlecraft tradition, we take the drawing down the moon position, which is holding arms outstretched above, and each of us resonates, does a kind of drawing down of the moon within ourselves as part of our own circles, so that the wisdom, the guidance, the intuitive dimensions that accompany a drawing down are actually happening internally within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
So it's a different approach than what some groups do, and I honor the diversity of connecting with the moon and the sacred force. Some groups will see the moon, most Wiccan groups see the moon in terms of goddess forms, but there are some groups that actually have the sun linked with goddesses and the moon linked with gods. And so a lot of that depends on where in the world the craft and or pagan tradition is rooted.
Mm-hmm. It's all very fascinating. It's really interesting. And insofar as watchtowers go, do you consider them spirits or more of a witch's earthly ancestors connection?
Well, I see the what some people call the watchtowers. For us, we work with them as elemental forces.
Hmm.
So we see them as forms of the divine.
Nice.
So the system that we work with is north, earth, air, east, fire, south, water, west, spirit, center. Now some groups work with four, and we work with five, so we actually work with that fifth element, spirit, which is a synthesis of the earth, air, fire, and water.
Nice.
And it depends on the ritual we're doing and who's facilitating it and what their own pagan roots are as to what names we'll be using for calling what some people say calling the corners, or calling the watchtowers, or calling the elements. And we recognize that there is a sacred force connected with each of those dimensions, and we take a more universalist approach that it can vary from place to place. So we do have some variety.
That's wonderful. And insofar as the circle itself goes, can you elaborate a little bit on the circle cast and what exactly we're dealing with we're creating a dimension between worlds, or how would you interpolate the information?
Yeah, that's well put. When we cast a circle, we see it not only as a means for us to be able to bond as a group. I'm talking about group work. You can do this individually as well, of course, but in terms of our group workings, when we're casting a circle, it helps us as a group connect with the common ground of being in that sacred space. It is protective in that forces that are in the larger universe that are extraneous to the work we're doing, the circle is set up as a boundary to deflect that, as a means of linking in with others doing circle work at that time. It is another connecting form. There are different ways of casting a circle. We typically will do the circumambulation, which is to walk the circle around. Someone will walk the circle around, sometimes using a ceremonial tool. And we typically will also join our hands, so we physically make a circle with the hand joining. Now, we have several places at Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve that are what some would call permanent circles. They are up year-round. Our stone circle is one of those places. It's atop a mound, a naturally occurring mound. It is a microlithic circle rather than a megalithic circle. People know of Stonehenge, and those are huge stones. They're megalithic. Our stones are much smaller, and they each time we do ritual there, we place stones. In fact, at this upcoming full moon circle, which will be on Friday night. I know some people are celebrating it Saturday night, but we have an additional event happening on Saturday, so that's why we're doing it on Friday night, so some people can stay over. So we will be adding to our stone circle, not only with stones that we bring from our own home areas, but we have people from all around the U.S. and other parts of the world that have brought some stones to our Pagan Spirit Gathering, and we'll be placing those as part of our circle casting.
How nice. Oh, that sounds awesome.
And there are certain chants, one that I created a number of years ago that we use from time to time, not at all of our rites, but at some of them. Circle of light, circle of sound, circle of spirit, circle around. And as the person casting the circle, myself or some other person that has been selected to do that, moves around in the circle, we in the circle chant that, and that way we connect together and we are energizing that space. And when a group does meditative work together, it is helpful to have a cast circle around them, not only for the protective qualities and the focus qualities, but as one as returning to a more waking state of consciousness. It can be like a homing device. It can help one reorient to the here and now when an inner journey is concluding.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And sometimes they take the circle down or they push it out. Now, when you say you keep your circles up all year round, obviously they're there in stone or representation. But do you psychically recharge it around the moon cycles?
Yes, and when we do rituals in these ceremonial spaces, we will. It's blessed as a space to be there all the time, but as we do our rituals, such as in the stone circle, we typically will do a casting to reinforce what's already there, to activate it.
Excellent. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And then at the end, we take a bit of the power of the circle within ourselves to guide us in our day-to-day life and return the rest of the power into the circle of stones. We have a spiral labyrinth, which is circular of sorts. It's a circle that spirals inward, and we've created that as a place for inner peace and world peace. We have a medicine wheel up at Spirit Rock, which is an ancient Native American holy place. The medicine wheel itself is a 20th century medicine wheel created by an Ojibwa medicine person from Canada. It was originally at a place in Illinois, but there was development going on in that part of the state, and the family that had the medicine wheel that had been created for their use decided to donate it to our center. So we actually have another kind of stone circle, a medicine wheel stone circle, that's about 20-some years old, that has been relocated up to our center. And we have the mugwort circle, which is a hedge of mugwort. It's around a giant maypole that we dance every year at the beginning of May and leave up year-round.
Nice.
So we have a whole variety of different circles in the 200 acres that Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve.
Oh, that's great. How wonderful. I love it. I could spend my life over there. Sounds like a great place.
We've expanded the times that we're available. We've had so many requests over the years for people that want to come and visit that we now are setting visiting days and hours and things each month, so that if a person isn't able to come during an event, hopefully one of the other days that we're open will work for a visit and being able to spend time on the property and do personal rituals at some of the ceremonial sites.
That's so wonderful. Wow, that's great. I'm sure the Earth's just loving that you all are over there, without a doubt. And speaking of that, what do you think is transpiring with the nature spirits of the day? With all the stuff that's happening to the world, and some people aren't as respectful, obviously, as others. What do you think the pulse is of the Earth these days?
Earth is in crisis. I mean, there's, in a way, when a human gets a fever, they've got the flu, they've got a fever, it's, often the body starts heating up, there's chills, the temperature spikes. Well, with the climate change that's unfolding on our planet, to me, it's a symptom of some imbalances and an attempt for the planet as a living system to rebalance itself. I have spent increasing amounts of time as part of my own personal practice as well as my organizational practice attempting to attune to the elemental forces, not just in rituals and calling on the sacred earth, the sacred air, sacred water, sacred spirit, but to be aware of their interplay, not only locally, but regionally, nationally, and globally. I have some real concerns about humankind's slowness to get the fact that how we are living our lives is having a negative impact on the whole system. And it's part of my personal work as well as Circle Sanctuary's work and the work of many, many other people to do some environmental education as well as environmental action. Mm-hmm. So our green cemetery is part of our quest to help a more sustainable world, but also paying attention to the wildlife on the property that we care for and doing what we can to sustain the songbirds and some of the other creatures, doing some networking with other people who are concerned about the environment, whether they be pagan, Wiccan, witches, or not, to really reach out and to share information as well as to collaborate on environmental initiatives to help move things further. And I think it's really essential that we, as humans, become more aware of not only what has been happening, but some ways that we can work together in our day-to-day lives in little things and in big things to help restore balance to the system that we're part of.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I totally agree with that. Yeah. So let's get that thing.
Yeah, Earth Day, we celebrate, the 8/7, the equinoxes, the solstices, the Celtic fire festivals in between. But we also celebrate what I call the 9th Sabbath, which is Earth Day. Mm-hmm. And we do some education there. And yes, we have an Earth Day ritual. And yes, we send out prayers for a better environment, and we give thanks for connections with creatures and the elements and the plants. But an important part of that ritual is motivating us to be able to take action, to be part of a force of positive change.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, energy and motion. Yep. Yeah, that's wonderful. And we're getting ready to wrap this up pretty soon. I do know you have to leave a little bit early to do your show, but let's go ahead and cover your once again, your website and also your show.
Okay, great. You can connect with me on Facebook, Selena Fox Updates, or Circle Sanctuary Community. You can connect with me on the web, www.selenafox.com, and through the Circle Sanctuary website, www.circlesanctuary.org. And you can connect with my podcast, circlepodcast.org, or go to the Circle Sanctuary website and look under our work and select Circle Craft Podcast from the drop-down menu. And we make our podcast free and available for online listening and as well as free downloads. I want to thank you and thank everyone that you work with for having me on Hyperspace tonight, and wish you and everyone many blessings, and may we all work together for a healthier planet and a world with more freedom.
Thank you, Selena. I just want to thank you very much for being on tonight. You're the witch, and we all love you and appreciate everything you're doing. And so thank you very much for being on tonight, and I hope to have you back very, very soon. And thank everybody for listening as well. So.
Well, thank you. Many blessings, and have a great night.
You too. And you've got a few minutes. So I'll let you go.
Yeah, and I'm starting a new series called Green Witchery. I'm going to teach about ways of working with plants as allies tonight, and we're going to do a show on wildcrafting and a show on magic mints and working with specific kinds of mint plants, not only for health and beauty of our gardens, but for spiritual practice.
Nice.
So we all are connected, and may we keep that in mind and put out well wishes for each other and the greater circle of nature of which we're part.
Absolutely. So mote it be. Beautiful.
So mote it be.
You take care, Selena. I don't want to keep you too long, so whenever you feel guided to hang up, you just go ahead and do that, and we'll.
Yeah, I think I will go ahead and get ready for my next show. Many blessings.
Many blessings to you
Bye-bye.
too. Thank you. Bye-bye. All right. I want to thank you all again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Selena is an incredible being, and please check out her website if you haven't already. And next coming up is Capricorn Philosophy Hour. That sounds great. On Dark Matter Radio Network. Thanks a lot, everybody, and I'll see you next week.